Noticing her mare's sudden and unusual labor, the old woman's suspicion flared. She checked the barn security cameras and froze. The footage revealed a horrifying truth, one that made her blood run cold. "This can't be real," she whispered, her heart pounding. "What's going on with Belle, Mrs. Smith?" she asked, her eyes fixed on the mare as she paced restlessly around the pen, her chest heaving with each labored breath, nostrils flaring as sharp snorts cut through the serene morning air. That morning, something was off. Spring had just begun, and the soft sunlight was barely peeking through the windows of the Smith family barn, casting long shadows across the hay-strewn floor. Belle, the sleek black mare they'd taken in a few years ago, had always been a gentle, even-tempered creature. She preferred the company of people over the hard work of the fields. But today, something was different. Her movements were erratic, almost frantic, and a light sheen of sweat glistened on her coat, a clear sign she hadn't slept well. Mrs. Smith approached the corral, lifting a hand to stroke Belle's silken mane. "Easy there, girl," she murmured, her voice low and soothing. "Everything's going to be fine." Yet deep down, worry gnawed at her. She had seen signs like this in other animals over the years, but never in Belle. The mare had shown no indications of pregnancy, no behavioral shifts, no swelling, no weight gain that might suggest a foal was on the way. And yet here she was, acting as if some profound change was imminent. Mrs. Smith realized she couldn't wait any longer. With steady hands, she reached for her cell phone, a device she didn't fully understand but had learned to use for emergencies, and dialed the number of the town's trusted veterinarian, Dr. Johnson. "Doctor, it's me, Mrs. Smith," she said, her tone calm but betraying an edge of urgency. "Something's wrong with Belle. Could you come to the farm? It might be serious." Dr. Johnson arrived in no time. He was an older man with steady hands and a deliberate, calming voice that always seemed to put people at ease. He had seen Belle many times before during routine checkups and knew her as a healthy, resilient animal. But the moment he stepped into the barn and saw her, his brow furrowed with concern. "You say she started acting this way this morning?" he asked, crouching to examine the mare more closely. "Since last night, but it's worse today," Mrs. Smith replied, the anxiety in her voice more evident now. "She's restless, and I'm worried that, well, something's happening." She hesitated to finish the thought aloud, as the idea of Belle being in labor without any prior signs seemed implausible. Dr. Johnson checked Belle's vitals in silence before turning to Mrs. Smith with a grave expression. "It looks like she's going into labor," he finally said, his words hitting her like a stone in the gut. "But let's not get ahead of ourselves. I'll prepare for complications just in case we need to be ready." Mrs. Smith nodded, her shock leaving her momentarily speechless. How could this be happening? Belle had never left the farm, and everyone in town knew they didn't own a stallion. Something didn't add up, and the unease lingered as she watched the doctor gather instruments and arrange the barn for what was apparently about to unfold. Night fell, but the tension in the air was almost tangible. Mrs. Smith couldn't sit still. The faint starlight barely illuminated the barn, but she felt the weight of mystery pressing in on her as if the shadows themselves whispered secrets. She was desperate to uncover answers. "I'm checking the cameras," she declared, making her way toward the small office in the shed. Her husband gave her a look of doubt but didn't argue. He knew better than to stand in her way once she'd made up her mind. With purposeful strides, Mrs. Smith entered the room and switched on the monitor. It flickered briefly before coming to life, the grainy images slowly loading onto the screen. As she waited, her thoughts raced through the countless possibilities. Belle had never been close to a stallion, or so she believed. Memories of how she had always been kept apart from other mares and stallions to avoid any risks now seemed to mock her. How, then, could she be on the verge of giving birth? As the scenes of the past few days replayed in her mind, a gnawing feeling in her stomach hinted that she was about to uncover something deeply unsettling. And then she saw it. Her heart skipped a beat. It had happened nearly 2 months ago on a quiet night when everyone was fast asleep. The cameras had captured a figure moving stealthily near Belle's pen. At first, it was just a shadow, a vague silhouette slipping cautiously through the side gate. But then the faint lights of the stable revealed more. The figure of a woman appeared, gently pushing the door open just enough to let a horse through. Mrs. Smith leaned closer to the screen, her eyes fixed on every movement. She watched as the horse, unmistakably a stallion, crossed the threshold and headed straight for Belle. Her breathing quickened. That moment, seemingly mundane, struck her as a betrayal of trust. Who would dare do something like this without telling us? She muttered under her breath. Rewinding the video, she paused it at a clearer shot of the stallion. Her breath caught in her throat as recognition set in. Tyson, she exclaimed, the name slipping from her lips. She knew the horse instantly. It was John's prize stallion, a neighbor she had known all her life. John was a good man, always kind and willing to lend a hand. But if that were true, why had this happened? And more importantly, who was the woman who had led Tyson into Belle's pen? One thing was certain. It hadn't been John. With her heart pounding, Mrs. Smith left the shed and found her husband waiting nearby. I've discovered something, she said, her voice trembling despite her efforts to stay composed. We need to talk to Dr. Johnson. Her mind whirled with questions that quickly morphed into suspicion. Why had someone brought Tyson to Belle without their consent? And what might this mean for the mare and the foal she now carried? As dawn broke, the soft hues of pink and orange painted the horizon. But Mrs. Smith felt none of the serenity of the morning. She had barely slept, her restless dreams haunted by unanswered questions. Rising early, she made her way to the stable. Belle was still there in her pen, but something was different. The mare paced back and forth, her movements restless as if seeking comfort in the rhythm of her steps. Mrs. Smith approached slowly, her heart heavy. She reached out to stroke Belle's neck, her touch gentle but her voice trembling. Easy now, my sweet girl. Everything's going to be okay, she whispered, though the anxiety laced in her words betrayed her attempt at reassurance. It wasn't long before Dr. Johnson arrived, his expression more serious than usual, only adding to the weight pressing on Mrs. Smith's chest. How's she doing? He asked, his medical bag in hand as he stepped closer to the pen. She won't stop pacing, and I think the contractions are getting stronger, she admitted, her voice tinged with worry. I don't know what to do. Despite years of caring for Belle, she had never faced anything like this, and the discovery on the camera footage lingered in her thoughts like a shadow refusing to fade. Dr. Johnson began his examination, his movements slow and deliberate as he checked Belle's breathing and palpated her swollen abdomen. His furrowed brow and the tightening of his jaw revealed more than he said aloud. After several tense minutes, he looked up, his tone grave but steady. Mrs. Smith, we need to act quickly. The foal is in a bad position. If we don't turn it, there could be serious complications. His words hit her like a blow, momentarily stealing her breath. But can it be done? She asked, trying to keep her voice calm even as fear welled inside her. Yes, but it won't be easy. I'll need help to try repositioning the foal. If we can't manage it, it could endanger Belle's life, he explained, his tone leaving no room for doubt. There was no time to waste. The urgency in his voice spurred her into action. Mr. Smith, who had been standing silently at the barn door, stepped inside to assist. Tell me what to do, doctor, he said. His voice steady though a faint edge of fear lingered beneath his calm demeanor. In the next few moments, the barn became a whirlwind of motion and hushed encouragements as Dr. Johnson and Mr. Smith worked side by side, following each instruction with precise care. Mrs. Smith knelt by Belle's head, stroking the mare's mane with tender hands, her voice soft and soothing. You're going to be okay, girl. We're here with you, she whispered repeatedly, as if willing her words to manifest a miracle. Yet deep inside, her thoughts kept circling back to the haunting images from the surveillance cameras, the woman who had mysteriously led Tyson into the paddock without permission. So many unanswered questions loomed in her mind, And while she knew saving Belle was all that mattered now, she couldn't shake the sense that everything was somehow connected. Minutes passed like hours, then finally, Dr. Johnson leaned back, wiping sweat from his brow. "We've managed to turn it," he announced, allowing a faint smile to soften his typically stern expression. "Now we just have to hope Belle can do the rest." Relief swept briefly through the air, but it was fleeting. The contractions returned with a brutal intensity, each one more grueling than the last. Belle snorted and trembled, her hooves striking the floor in a desperate rhythm that wrenched at their hearts. Mrs. Smith stayed at her side, holding the mare close, whispering reassurances even as her own hands quaked with fear. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a sharp, piercing whinny echoed through the barn. Belle made one final, agonizing push and the foal was born. It was small, frail, slick with fluid, and barely moving, but it was alive. For a brief moment, the world stood still as everyone held their breath, watching to see if it would move, if it would take its first breath. And then it did. The tiny foal shifted its legs, attempting to rise, and let out a soft, weak sound. Tears streamed down Mrs. Smith's face as relief washed over her. "Thank God," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Thank you, my girl." But the joy was short-lived as Dr. Johnson approached to examine the newborn, his expression shifting, his brows knitting together in concern. There was something off, something unusual about the foal. "This isn't normal," he murmured, his voice heavy with unease. He turned to Mrs. Smith, who was still dabbing tears from her cheeks. The foal, still wobbly and covered in straw, struggled to stand, its awkward, trembling movements betraying a strange distortion in its posture. Its limbs seemed to bend unnaturally, its delicate body curving in ways that didn't seem right. Dr. Johnson studied it with the intensity of a man searching for answers amid chaos, while Mrs. Smith could only see a fragile creature that had fought so hard to be born, now seemingly paying a heavy price for that fight. "Doctor, what's wrong?" she asked, breaking the heavy silence that had fallen over the barn, her voice barely above a whisper as though she feared her words might somehow disturb the foal. "What's wrong with him?" Dr. Johnson straightened, letting out a deep sigh as he wiped his hands on a handkerchief pulled from his pocket. "I can't say for certain, Mrs. Smith," he began carefully, "but there are signs that worry me. His joints don't appear to be fully developed, and his spine. There's something strange about its curvature." He hesitated, his gaze fixed on the struggling foal. "It could be a genetic deformity, or it might have something to do with how he was conceived." Those last words sent a chill down Mrs. Smith's spine. "How he was conceived," she repeated, her voice tinged with disbelief, though deep down she knew exactly what he meant. Her mind raced back to the security footage, to the shadowy figure leading Tyson into Belle's paddock under the cover of night. A new urgency surged within her, eclipsing her fear. "We can't leave it like this, doctor," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions roiling inside her. "I need to know who did this, why it happened, and if Tyson is involved, we need answers from John." The next day, the Smith family prepared for what they knew would be an uncomfortable conversation. The morning air was crisp despite the sun hanging high in the sky. Mrs. Smith had put on her finest coat, not to impress but to feel shielded, as if the thick fabric could protect her from the harsh words that lay ahead. John met them on his porch, his face clouded with confusion. Mr. Smith greeted him, his usual light-hearted demeanor replaced with a rare seriousness. "We need to discuss something we've discovered." John gestured for them to step inside, but Mrs. Smith shook her head. "We'd rather stay out here if that's all right with you," she said firmly. She didn't want to be confined by walls when the storm she sensed was brewing finally broke. "What's this about?" John asked, his unease evident. Mrs. Smith took a steadying breath before speaking. "We've had an unusual situation with Belle last night when she gave birth. Dr. Johnson noticed something odd about the foal, so we checked the security cameras. We saw Tyson, your horse, in our care. Can you explain that?" John blinked in disbelief. "Tyson? No, I had no idea. He's in the stable every night. I've never noticed him gone. He paused, a flicker of realization crossing his face. But lately, Clara's been acting strange. I didn't want to mention it until I was sure, but maybe we should talk to her. Mrs. Smith felt a tightening in her chest. She had hoped John would deny everything outright, that he would insist Tyson had never left his stall. But the mention of Clara, John's daughter, always so kind and reserved, unnerved her. Then it's best we clear this up now, she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. Call Clara. We need answers. John disappeared inside and returned a few minutes later with Clara by his side. The young woman looked visibly uneasy, her shoulders stiff and her gaze fixed on the ground. Mrs. Smith noticed she couldn't meet the eyes of either her father or the Smiths, a detail that spoke volumes. Clara stood before them, her posture slumped as if carrying an unbearable weight. The air was thick with tension, the unspoken words hanging heavily between them on the porch. The silence felt oppressive, nearly suffocating. Explain to me what happened, Mrs. Smith finally said, her voice firm yet carefully controlled, betraying the effort it took to remain composed. Why did you bring Tyson to Bell's corral without telling us? Clara's eyes flicked up for just a moment, meeting the stern faces of the Smiths and the worry etched into her father's expression. She bit her lip, searching for the right words, though she knew no explanation would undo what she had done. I thought I was doing something good, she began, her voice barely a whisper. My family, we've been going through a tough time financially. When I found out how valuable Tyson was, I thought that if Bell had a foal by him, we could sell it. The money would really help us. Her words spilled out slowly, each one heavier than the last. Mrs. Smith felt a wave of anger rising within her, a flood threatening to break its dam. She had dedicated her life to caring for Bell, ensuring the mare lived a peaceful, dignified life. The idea that someone would exploit her horse for selfish gain churned her stomach. And you thought that was all right? Mrs. Smith demanded, her voice now tinged with disbelief and simmering rage. You thought you could take Tyson in the dead of night, carry out your plan, and no one would notice? She took a step closer, her words cutting through the cold morning air. Belle isn't just an animal to us. She's family. Clara shivered at the harsh tone of Mrs. Smith's voice, yet this time she didn't avert her gaze. I know, and I'm not trying to excuse what I did, she said, her voice trembling. I made a mistake, and I regret it deeply. I just wanted to help my dad and myself. I never thought things would spiral out of control like this. John, who had been silent until now, turned to his daughter with a mix of sorrow and bewilderment etched across his face. Why didn't you tell me, Clara? He asked, his voice low and heavy with disappointment. If you needed help, you should have come to me. You can't make decisions like this without thinking about the consequences. Tears streamed down Clara's cheeks, and in that moment, she looked smaller, like a child overwhelmed by a mistake far too big to comprehend. I didn't want to burden you more, she said, wiping her tears with her sleeve. All I wanted was to find a solution, but now I see I only made things worse. Mrs. Smith drew a deep breath, striving to remain calm even as her thoughts raced. She had expected answers, but Clara's confession had only brought more questions and complications. She wasn't sure how to handle the weight of what she'd just learned. The one thing she knew for certain was that she couldn't let this slide. Belle and the foal deserved better. I'm sorry you're dealing with difficulties, Clara. I truly am, she said, her voice softening though the anger still flickered in her eyes. But that doesn't justify what you did. You had no right to make decisions about Belle, especially not in this way. Clara nodded, absorbing the words like a punishment she knew she deserved. I understand. I'll do whatever it takes to make it right to help the foal and Belle, she offered, though her voice was frail and broken. Mrs. Smith closed her eyes for a moment, trying to calm the storm within before she spoke again. A swirl of emotions churned in her heart, anger at the betrayal, sorrow over the situation, and a faint glimmer of empathy for Clara, who had clearly gotten herself into something far beyond her depth. "I don't know if there's anything you can do to fix this," she finally said, opening her eyes to meet Clara's. "What I do know is that I don't want to see you near Belle or our ranch again. This has already been painful enough for everyone, and I believe the best thing is for you to stay away." Her words fell like a verdict, and the anguish on Clara's face was unmistakable. Yet she didn't argue or beg. She simply nodded, accepting Mrs. Smith's decision, knowing her own choices had led her to this moment. "I understand," she murmured, her eyes turning to her father.
"Dad, I'm sorry."
"I never wanted things to end like this." After the tense confrontation with Clara, Mrs. Smith returned to the ranch with a lighter chest but a sadness that clung to her heart like a thorn. It had been hard to tell the young woman not to come back, but she knew it was necessary. She had to protect Belle and the fragile little foal born into a world of chaos and heartbreak. Now, with Clara gone, the Smith family could focus on what mattered most: caring for their animals and ensuring that nothing like this ever happened again. By the time Mrs. Smith reached the barn, night had fallen. The air was still, broken only by the soft snores of the mares and the faint rustling of the wind slipping through the wooden slats. Belle lay resting, her golden coat gleaming faintly under the dim light, recovering from everything she had endured. Beside her, the foal flicked its ears curiously, still unsteady on its slender legs but growing stronger with each passing moment. Mrs. Smith approached slowly, her boots sinking slightly into the straw as she knelt beside them. "Hey there, sweet girl," she whispered, gently stroking Belle's neck. The mare lifted her head, meeting her gaze with deep, wise eyes that always seemed to understand more than words could convey. "Everything's going to be all right. You hear me? We'll take care of you and your baby. No one will harm you again." The foal, who had been awkwardly exploring the stall, wobbled over to Mrs. Smith and sniffed her hands as if trying to get to know her. It was small and delicate, but in its movements, there was a vitality that reminded Mrs. Smith of Belle in her youth, so full of life and curiosity. A warm smile spread across her face as she felt something melt inside her chest. For a fleeting moment, she forgot everything that had happened. "I'll call you Spark," she murmured softly, as if testing the name on her lips, "because you're a gift to us all. A gift we never expected, but one that has brought hope." Gently stroking Spark's soft head, she realized that for the first time in ages, a small spark of joy had emerged amidst the storm. The next morning, the Smith family gathered around the kitchen table where the golden light of dawn streamed through the windows, illuminating their tired but resolute faces. They had spent a long night discussing what needed to be done moving forward. Decisions had to be made, and Mrs. Smith knew she had to be unwavering. There was no room for error now. "We must make sure this never happens again," she declared, her gaze steady as it swept over her husband and children. "I'm going to improve the ranch's security. We'll need taller fences and I'll install more cameras. We can't rely on luck to keep our mares safe." Mr. Smith nodded, recognizing the gravity of her words. "Whatever you decide, dear, you've always known what's best for the animals, and I'll support you." He knew the countless sleepless nights she'd endured worrying about Belle, and he was ready to do whatever it took to help. But security wasn't their only concern. The veterinarian, Dr. Johnson, had mentioned that the newborn colt would require special care due to his complicated birth. Mrs. Smith wasn't going to leave anything to chance. "Aside from reinforcing security, I'll make sure Spark gets the best care possible," she resolved aloud. "I'll ask Dr. Johnson to visit more often. I don't care how much it costs. I want to ensure he grows up healthy and strong." Her family responded with nods of agreement. The Smiths had always prioritized the well-being of their animals above all else, and this time would be no different. Over the following weeks, they dedicated themselves to the stables like never before. Mr. Smith worked tirelessly to reinforce fences, install new locks, and position cameras at strategic locations. Meanwhile, Mrs. Smith spent her mornings tending to Belle and Spark, monitoring every small improvement and ensuring the colt was well fed and nurtured. Those first weeks were tough. Spark was fragile and needed far more attention than most foals, but gradually he grew stronger, running a little farther each day, exploring his small world with the boundless curiosity of his age. The entire family rallied around him, not out of obligation but because the little colt became a source of joy that helped them all heal. One afternoon, as Mrs. Smith watched Spark trot around the paddock, she felt a profound sense of fulfillment. It was like witnessing something broken come back to life, a flower blooming after a long drought. In that moment, she knew she'd made the right choice by confronting Clara and ensuring she wouldn't return. While the past couldn't be undone, at least she could protect the future. "You're a fighter, Spark," she said aloud, as if the colt could understand her. "Just like your mother. And I'll always be here for both of you, to care for you, to protect you." As the days passed, life at the Smith Ranch slowly began to return to its usual rhythm. Yet Spark's presence added a touch of happiness that hadn't been felt in a long time. Each morning, Mrs. Smith rose early, brewed a strong cup of coffee, and made her way to the stables. There she was greeted by Belle's gentle whinnies and Spark's playful antics. Despite everything they had endured, she found solace in those quiet moments, in the sound of hooves on the earth, the scent of hay in the air, and the sweetness in her mare's trusting eyes. One crisp October afternoon, while Mrs. Smith was brushing Belle beneath the shade of an ancient oak tree, the faint sound of a wagon approached from the distance. She looked up to see John walking toward her, his expression serious yet calm. It had been weeks since their last meaningful conversation, though they hadn't avoided each other entirely. Their exchanges had been brief and perfunctory, yet Mrs. Smith knew he had been fulfilling his side of their agreement. Tyson remained in his stable, and John had ensured no further incidents occurred. "Good afternoon, John," she greeted him, setting the brush aside. "Is everything all right?" John nodded, though a hint of discomfort shadowed his face. "Everything's fine, Mrs. Smith. I just wanted to talk, if you don't mind." Removing her work gloves, Mrs. Smith inclined her head. "Of course. What's on your mind?" John took a deep breath as though gathering his thoughts carefully. "First, I wanted to thank you for how you handled everything. I know the situation with Clara was complicated, and you could have taken a much harsher route, but you didn't. I want you to know I appreciate that, and I'm truly sorry for everything that happened." Mrs. Smith listened quietly, nodding occasionally. She had spent many sleepless nights reflecting on her decision not to take legal action against Clara. In the end, she had chosen to move forward, hoping to prevent any further harm while ensuring such issues wouldn't arise again. "I appreciate your words, John," she said after a pause, her tone measured. "I hope Clara is doing well, but we need to be clear about something." "I understand," he interrupted gently. "And I promise you Tyson will not come near Belle unless you expressly allow it." He hesitated, clearly grappling with his next words. "But I also wanted to talk to you about Tyson. I know he's part of the reason things became so difficult, and I know he must remind you of everything that happened. But please believe me when I say it was never my intention for him to cause trouble. Tyson means a great deal to me." Mrs. Smith studied him, seeing the genuine struggle behind his eyes. She knew Tyson bore no blame for what had transpired. Despite the challenges, the horse deserved care and compassion. "John, I hold no resentment towards Tyson," she said softly. "All I want is for him to be well cared for, not to suffer because of choices others made. If you're willing to ensure that, I believe we can find a way to move forward without further conflict." From there, the conversation unfolded with greater ease. They discussed Tyson's needs in detail, and John promised to monitor him closely, ensuring he wouldn't wander near the Smith Mares without explicit permission. As a gesture of goodwill, John offered to help around the farm whenever needed, expressing his gratitude for Mrs. Smith's patience. He brought small tokens of appreciation, homemade pies or freshly baked bread, as if to make amends for the past. Mrs. Smith accepted his kindness without much comment, but deep down, she recognized and valued his efforts. John hadn't been the direct cause of the problems, Yet he fully understood their weight and was determined to prove he could contribute positively to their lives instead of being a source of strife. As October's brisk air swept across the Smith farm, carrying the scent of pumpkins and dried leaves, a festive energy settled over the land. It was Halloween Eve, and Mrs. Smith decided the occasion was perfect for a gathering, not only to celebrate the season but also to formally introduce Spark, the cheerful new addition to her family. For days, she had been preparing the farm for the event. Twinkling string lights now adorned the barn, casting a warm glow over the yard. Garlands of dried flowers hung in graceful loops, and pumpkins of every size were scattered artfully throughout the space. Some had been carved into whimsical grinning faces that seemed to keep watch over the festivities. A long table stood to one side, adorned with colorful tablecloths and vases of seasonal flowers, ready to welcome guests with hot coffee, pumpkin pie, and other beloved American treats. Everything was set for the occasion. That afternoon, as she added the finishing touches, Mrs. Smith paused for a moment to admire her work. "It looks beautiful," she thought, a warm smile spreading across her face. But more importantly, this small gathering wasn't just for her friends. It was for Belle and Spark as well. After all they had endured, they deserved a moment of joy surrounded by love and companionship. The first arrivals were longtime neighbors, people who had known Belle since she was just a filly and were delighted to see that despite everything the farm had endured, she looked just as radiant as she did in her prime. "Belle, look at her. She's glowing. She looks just like she did in her prime," Mrs. Rodriguez remarked, approaching with a basket of homemade cornbread to share. "Yes, she's better than ever," Mrs. Smith replied, her voice tinged with pride. "And that little one over there," she said, pointing to Spark, who was happily playing among some scattered pumpkins. "She's the reason Belle has found happiness again." As evening fell, the farm came alive with laughter, animated conversations, and the gentle rustling of leaves in the wind. Guests gathered around a fire pit that Mr. Smith had prepared in the yard, sharing stories and memories. Others wandered through the stable to get a closer look at Spark. At first shy, the young foal soon grew comfortable with the attention, approaching people with curious sniffs and flicks of her ears. "She's stunning," a young woman visiting the farm for the first time remarked.